The cold was the first thing to truly notice, a deep, metallic chill that seeped into the bones and stole the warmth from the air itself. It was the cold of a vessel that sailed not through the void between stars, but through the roiling, soul-stained tides of the Empyrean. The divine sacrifice was a name spoken in hushed tones in the systems it visited, a leviathan of dark iron and grim purpose. Its corridors were arteries of shadow, lit only by the intermittent blood-red glow of lumen strips that cast long, dancing shapes upon the walls. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of ozone, fear, and the faint, coppery tang of old blood that no amount of scrubbing could ever erase. Into this oppressive silence, a new cargo was being processed. They moved in a shambling, chained line, their faces pale and eyes wide with a terror too profound for screams. They were the psykers, the sanctioned, the damned. Among them, a girl of 10 years, Elara, clutched the frayed edges of her thin tunic. Her small world had been one of quiet fields and a sun that felt warm on her skin, but that was a lifetime ago. Now, a new awareness prickled at the edges of her mind, a buzzing hum that was not of the ship's engines. It was the Gellar field, a constant, low thrum that was the only barrier between the mortal shell of the ship and the howling madness of the warp. And beneath that hum, she could hear them, whispers. Not voices, not quite, but the psychic residue of things that slithered and gibbered in the unseen spaces, promising things in languages of nightmare. Overseeing the procession was Officer Valerius, a man carved from the same grim granite as the ship he served. His uniform was crisp, his gaze a flat, assessing sweep that missed nothing. He stood with a data slate in hand, his movements efficient and devoid of wasted motion. Each checkmark he made was a verdict, a final administrative stamp on a fate already sealed. His presence was a pillar of unyielding authority in the chaotic dread of the hold. Nearby, Confessor Ignatius raised his voice, the words echoing in the cavernous space. He was a figure of fire and shadow, his red and black robes a splash of color in the monochrome gloom. His sermon was a familiar one, a litany of duty and sacrifice. He spoke of the God Emperor's eternal vigil upon the golden throne, of the holy fuel required to sustain his light against the endless dark. He called their fate a privilege, a final, glorious service to all of humanity. The words were meant to offer solace, to frame their terrifying end as a beginning of cosmic significance, but they fell upon the silent, fearful psykers like stones into a deep, still well. Elara listened, her young mind trying to grasp the concepts of holy duty and eternal purpose, but all she could feel was the oppressive weight of the metal around her, the cold that leached into her soul, and the terrifying, beautiful, and awful new sense that was waking up inside her, screaming in time. With the warp whispers just beyond the thin skin of reality, the whispers were not just sounds, they were textures, tastes, and colors that did not belong in a sane world. For Elara, huddled in a recessed corner of the cold metal hold, the psychic cacophony was a storm only she could perceive. It was a tapestry woven from the agonies of a million lost souls, the predatory hungers of things that watch from beyond, and the constant, grinding pressure of the Gellar field, a pressure that felt like a giant, invisible hand slowly squeezing the air from her lungs. She pressed her small hands over her ears, a futile gesture against the noise that resonated from within her own mind. Each chaotic warp voice was a shard of ice scraping against her thoughts, and with them came the visions. They were not memories so much as sensations, vivid and brutal. The smell of smoke and ozone as men in dark carapace armor kicked down the door of her family's hab unit. The sight of her mother's face, a mask of terror and denial before a crackling shock maul silenced her forever. The feeling of rough hands dragging her from the only home she had ever known, her own small, desperate screams swallowed by the indifferent city. These flashes of past trauma played behind her eyes on a relentless loop, each one amplified and distorted by the warp's echo, until she could no longer distinguish the memory from the nightmare. Her only anchor in the maelstrom was a small, threadbare stuffed toy, a low-fur bear named Barrow. One of its button eyes was missing, and its stuffing was matted and thin, but it was the last physical remnant of her life before. She clutched it to her chest so tightly her knuckles turned white, burying her face in its faded fabric, trying to breathe in the faint, ghostly scent of home that might still linger there. The rough texture of the worn plush was a real, tangible thing in a world of encroaching psychic phantoms, a tiny island of solidity in the shifting sea of her fear. With trembling fingers, she retrieved a crumpled scrap of paper and a tiny piece of charcoal she had managed to hide. In the dim, pulsing red light, she began to scratch out words, her script uneven and childlike. The man in red says we go to see the Emperor. He says it is a good thing, but the ship is so loud, it talks to me. It shows me bad pictures, Mama's face, the fire. I am so scared. Barrow is scared too. I don't want to be fuel, I want to go home. I don't think the Emperor wants to see me cry. The simple, terrified confession was a desperate attempt to impose order on the chaos, to trap the shapeless dread in the cage of written words. But the words only made it more real. She folded the paper into a tiny, tight square and tucked it deep into a seam in Barrow's back, a secret diary for a doomed journey. Lifting her head, she peered through the forest of legs and chains. Further down the hold, a commotion broke the tense silence. A man, his eyes wide and glowing with a faint, unnatural light, had begun to convulse, psychic energy crackling around his twitching fingers. He was speaking in tongues, a torrent of guttural, impossible syllables. Guards were on him in an instant, their movements brutal and efficient. A shock prod was jammed into his side, the sound of its discharge a sharp, sickening crackle. The man screamed, a raw, animal sound, before his body went limp. Heavy, ceramite-reinforced restraints were clamped around his wrists, and a psych-dampening collar was locked around his neck. Alara did not just see it, she felt it. A wave of shared dread washed over her from the other psychers in the hold, a silent, psychic scream of collective terror and empathy. She could feel the man's final, fleeting burst of agony and confusion, and then the terrible, hollow emptiness as the dampeners took hold. It was a preview of her own future, a shared fate that bound them all together in a chain of silent, screaming comprehension. She pulled Barrow closer, the stuffed toy a poor shield against the chilling truth that she was not alone in her fear, but that their shared terror only made the darkness around them feel deeper and more absolute. The manifest was a litany of the damned, a dry, administrative list that belied the ocean of suffering it represented. Officer Valerius sat in the stark, functional quiet of his quarters, the glow of the data slate painting his face in pale, shifting hues. Each entry was a name, a world of origin, a scrawled note on psychic designation, and a final, grim status: contained, processed, for transit. His stylus moved with practiced, detached efficiency, his mind a fortress against the emotional resonance that clung to the digital parchment like psychic residue. He had been trained for this, his mind fortified by years of indoctrination and battlefield experience. The lessons were a familiar mantra, echoing in the quiet chambers of his memory. The witch is a gateway. The mutant is a corruption. The Xenos is a blight. The Emperor's light is the only purity, and its fuel is a necessary sacrifice. He had recited these tenets as a cadet, had seen their truth in the flesh-rending horrors of the warp that he had witnessed on other, less sanctioned battlefields. This was cleaner in its own way, more clinical. A chime from his console broke his concentration. He keyed a rune, and the air filled with the crackling, distorted audio of a Vox record. The voice was metallic, stripped of all humanity, a direct transmission from the hallowed bureaucracies of Terra itself. Priority Alpha Directive expedite all sanctioned cargo to the throne world. Projected temporal anomalies within the immaterium necessitate accelerated transit schedules. The astronomican's beacon fluctuates. His eternal vigilance must not waver. The sacrifice is not an option. It is the foundation of our species' survival. Compliance is absolute. The message ended with a burst of static, the urgency of its command hanging in the air like a threat. It was a reminder from the very heart of the Imperium, a cold, hard statement of fact that brooked no argument. The psykers were not people. They were cargo, a critical logistical component in the endless war for human existence. Rising from his desk, Valerius decided on a final inspection tour before securing the hold for the next warp translation. The corridors of the divine sacrifice were a study in grim order, the air humming with the latent power of the Gellar field and the low thrum of the engines. He moved with a purpose that was both commanding and isolating, the ship's crew parting before him with silent deference. As he approached the primary holding bay, a spike of psychic static made the lumen strips flicker. He quickened his pace. Through the armored viewing port, the scene unfolded with a brutal, practiced choreography. A young woman, her stringy hair plastered to a sweat-sheened face, was in the throes of a seizure. Her body arched against her restraints, her eyes rolled back to show the whites, which were now veined with crawling, actinic light. A low moan escaped her lips, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very deck plates. The two guards assigned to the bay did not hesitate. There was no attempt at comfort, no word of calming reassurance. Their movements were a brutal ballet of suppression. One drove a shock maul into her ribs, the impact a sickening thud. The other clamped a heavy, silvered collar around her neck. As its psych-dampening field activated with a high-pitched whine, the light died in her eyes and she slumped, a puppet with its strings cut. One of the guards gave her limp form a contemptuous shove with his boot to ensure she was properly secured. Valerius watched, his face a mask of impassive authority. This was procedure. This was necessity. An uncontrolled psyker was a breach in the ship's spiritual integrity, a potential doorway for the things that hunted in the warp. The guards had acted correctly with the swift, decisive violence required to maintain containment. Yet, as he stood there, the cold, administrative logic of the manifest and the urgent, disembodied voice from Terra collided with the raw, visceral reality before him. He saw the girl's youth, the utter vulnerability in her unconscious form, the casual brutality of the boot against her side. It was a tiny, hairline fracture in the foundation of his certainty. The thought was treasonous, fleeting, and instantly suppressed, but it had been there nonetheless. A silent, unwelcome question about the price of this holy duty, and whether a foundation built on such suffering could ever truly be called holy. The air in the hold was thick enough to drink, a soupy mixture of recycled oxygen, human sweat, and the faint, metallic tang of fear. It was a congregation of the condemned, gathered not in a house of worship, but in a cage of cold iron, their pews the hard, grating floor of the ship's belly. At the center of this grim assembly stood Confessor Ignatius, a pillar of fire and faith amidst the gray despair. His voice, amplified by the voxcasters mounted on his ornate vestments, did not so much speak as resonate. a deep, rolling timbre that vibrated in the chest and demanded attention. He was performing the most sacred and terrible of his duties, weaving a narrative of glory from the threads of their impending doom. His sermon was a tapestry of imperial scripture, each verse a carefully chosen brick in the wall of justification he was building around their fate. He quoted from the Lectitio Divinitatis, from the sermons of Sebastian Thor, from ancient decrees issued from the very foot of the Golden Throne. He spoke of the God Emperor's eternal, agonizing vigil, a suffering beyond human comprehension undertaken for the sole purpose of shielding an ungrateful galaxy from the predators of the warp. He described the Astronomicon, that mighty psychic beacon that guided all Imperial ships through the void, not as a mere light but as the manifested will of a god, a fire that required constant fuel. And that fuel, he declared, his voice rising to a fervent pitch, was them. Their souls, their very life essence, were the sacred oil that kept the lamp of humanity burning. "You are not victims," he thundered, the words echoing off the distant ceiling. "You are volunteers in the greatest war ever fought. Your sacrifice is the shield that protects your families, your home worlds, every man, woman, and child who breathes the free air of the Imperium. To be chosen for this is the highest honor, a destiny that transcends mortal understanding." He painted a picture of their end not as a consumption, but as a merging, a glorious return to the divine source of all human spirit. They would become one with the Emperor's light, their individual suffering erased in the incandescent totality of his purpose. Among the sea of bowed heads and hollow eyes, Ilara listened. She clutched Barrow tightly, her small body trembling not from the cold but from the effort of comprehension. The confessor's words were powerful, a strong, steady rhythm that fought against the chaotic whispers in her mind. She tried to grasp them, to wrap her faith around the concept of a holy purpose. If the Emperor was so good, so powerful, then maybe he did need their help. Maybe her fear and the bad pictures in her head were just a test. And if she could be brave, if she could believe, then the screaming in the warp would stop and she would finally feel the golden warmth the confessor promised. It was a desperate, fragile hope, a single candle lit against an overwhelming darkness, but she clung to it with all the strength of her 10 years. Behind the mask of fervent devotion, however, a different truth churned. As Ignatius's voice boomed with absolute conviction, his mind was a battleground. "They are so young," a traitorous thought whispered as his eyes scanned the faces before him, seeing Ilara's desperate hope. "They are not warriors. They are frightened children and broken adults, and I am telling them that their murder is a blessing." He remembered his own childhood, a life of piety and prayer, of believing in the inherent goodness of the God Emperor's plan. He had joined the ecclesiarchy to bring solace, to heal spiritual wounds. Now, he administered a different kind of solace, the kind that prepared the lamb for the slaughter. The scriptures he quoted were true, their logic was impeccable, but the gap between holy text and the raw, terrified humanity in this hold felt like an unbridgeable chasm. He saw the emptiness in the eyes of those who had already given up, the quiet despair that his words could not touch. And in those moments, his unshakable faith felt like a suit of armor that was just a little too tight, constricting a heart that still, despite everything, dared to feel a flicker of pity. But he crushed that flicker, feeding it to the furnace of his duty. Doubt was a heresy, and compassion for the damned was a gateway to that heresy. So he preached on, his voice a bastion of certainty, each booming declaration, a hammer blow meant to seal the cracks in his own resolve as much as to comfort the souls he was sending to their end. The echoes of Ignatius's final, booming pronouncement hung in the air, a spiritual aftershock that left the hold in a silence more profound than before. The grand tapestry of divine purpose he had woven began to fray at the edges as it settled upon the congregation. The psykers, a collection of fractured souls, received his words not with unified acceptance, but with the entire spectrum of human despair and desperate faith. Some bowed their heads, their lips moving in silent, fervent prayers, clutching at the promise of meaning like a lifeline in a stormy sea. They repeated the catechisms of sacrifice, their whispers a fragile chorus against the ever-present hum of the Geller field, trying to transmute their terror into piety. Others simply broke. A man near the back began to rock back and forth, his low, guttural sobs a counterpoint to the confessor's fading oratory. A woman drew her knees to her chest, her face buried, her shoulders shaking with silent, hopeless tears. The grand design of imperial theology shattered upon the rocks of individual human fear, leaving behind a beach littered with private agonies. Alara felt the collective emotional collapse as a physical pressure, a psychic tide of despair that threatened to pull her under. The hopeful little candle she had lit during the sermon guttered, its flame nearly extinguished by the cold wind of shared sorrow. She squeezed Barrow so tightly the worn seams threatened to split, her small frame trembling violently as she fought back her own tears. It was in this moment of her imminent drowning that a shadow fell over her, not one of threat, but of unexpected shelter. Guard Marcus, his face a careful mask of neutral duty, paused his patrol near her recess. His movement was a subtle shift, positioning his armored bulk between her and the view of the most distraught psykers. He did not look at her, his gaze scanning the hold as regulations demanded, but as he adjusted the grip on his las rifle, his voice, low and meant only for her, cut through the static of her fear. "Courage, little one," he murmured, the words barely a breath. "The Emperor sees your heart." It was a simple phrase, a fragment of the standard spiritual consolation taught to all Imperial personnel, but the tone was different. It lacked the booming certainty of Ignatius, carrying instead a weary, genuine kindness that felt more real than any scripture. For Alara, it was a hand reaching into the abyss. The words did not erase her fear, but they gave it a companion. She was not just a nameless, frightened fuel source. She was a little one, and her heart was seen. She uncurled slightly, her grip on Barrow loosening just enough to draw a shaky breath, her wide, damp eyes fixed on the ceramic plating of the guard's leg armor as if it were a bastion wall. From his elevated position, Confessor Ignatius observed the brief, almost imperceptible exchange. His trained eye, accustomed to reading the micro-expressions of heretics and faithful alike, caught the slight softening around Guard Marcus's eyes, the minute dip of his helmet as he spoke. The sight sent a complex, unwelcome ripple through the confessor's soul. On one hand, it was a breach of protocol, a dangerous sentimentalism that blurred the necessary lines between jailer and cargo. This was the path to doubt, to questioning the grim arithmetic of salvation. Yet, another part of him, a part he kept locked in a deep, dark chamber of his heart, stirred with something akin to gratitude. He saw the way the child's trembling stilled, the tiny spark of comfort that the guard's illicit kindness had provided. It was a spark his own grand sermon had failed to ignite. For a long, heavy moment, Ignatius wrestled with the dichotomy, the cold, clean purity of duty against the messy, compassionate impulse of humanity. In the end, duty won, as it always must. He remained silent, offering no reprimand but also no endorsement. He simply turned his gaze away, a silent acknowledgement of a battle between compassion and necessity that he himself fought every second, a battle he could never afford to win. As the confessor's attention shifted, a new sound emerged from the huddled mass of psykers. It was a whisper, thin and frayed, from an old man whose face was a roadmap of sorrow. Is there redemption for us?" he asked the air, his voice cracking with a lifetime of regret and fear. "Not in the throne, but for what we are." The question hung in the thick, ozone-scented air, a plea for absolution that addressed the fundamental terror of their existence, the fear that their very nature was a sin beyond any service. It was a question the Imperial Creed had no answer for, a theological void. The silence that followed was its only reply, a crushing, absolute negation that was more terrible than any shouted condemnation. The sermon was over, but its true, harrowing message was just beginning to be understood. The transition was not a gentle slipping, but a violent, gut-wrenching tear. One moment, the divine sacrifice sailed through the placid, star-dusted black of the void. The next, reality itself screamed. The ship shuddered as if gripped by a colossal, unseen hand, the groan of its adamantium skeleton a roar of protest. The steady, reassuring thrum of the Gellar field intensified, climbing from a background hum to a piercing, teeth-rattling whine that vibrated through every deck plate and bulkhead, a desperate hymn against the encroaching madness. The warp had them, and it was not a calm sea. Within the hold, the world dissolved into a nightmare of perception. The solid, grim certainty of the metal walls seemed to waver, their edges bleeding into shifting, amorphous shadows that coiled and twisted just beyond the corner of the eye. The lumen strips flickered erratically, casting strobing, jagged light that made the chained psykers appear as figures in a broken pict feed, their movements jerky and unnatural. Eerie echoes rebounded from the suddenly porous walls, not the repetition of sound, but the distortion of it. A guard's bootstep would be followed by a sound like breaking glass or a distant, mournful sigh. The air grew thick and cold, carrying a scent that was both cloyingly sweet, like rotting flowers, and sharply metallic, like spilled blood. For the psykers, the turbulence was not merely external. It was a cataclysm within their souls. Their already heightened senses were violently amplified, the chaotic whispers of the warp swelling into a psychic hurricane. A man who feared drowning thrashed against his restraints, gasping for air that was not there, his face turning a livid purple. A woman who had witnessed her family burn covered her eyes, screaming. As phantom flames licked at her skin, the smell of charred flesh filling her nostrils. Their latent powers, usually suppressed by fear and dampeners, flared uncontrollably. A cascade of sparks erupted from one psyker's fingertips, fizzling against the deck. Another caused the air around him to shimmer with heat haze, the chains on his wrists glowing a dull red. Alara curled into the tightest ball she could manage, pressing herself into the cold corner, barrow a damp, tear-stained lump against her cheek. The warp's assault was a physical thing, a torrent of other people's terrors and her own worst memories crashing over her in overlapping waves. She saw the men in dark armor again, but now their faces were melting, their voices the gibbering of demons. She felt the cold of the ship become the absolute cold of the grave. Despair, thick and black as crude oil, threatened to fill her lungs and suffocate her. But then, piercing through the storm of fear, a light appeared. It was not the flickering, sickly light of the lumen strips, but a warm, brilliant, and impossibly distant gold. It bloomed in the darkness behind her eyes, a serene, unwavering point in the chaotic tempest. It felt paternal, ancient, powerful beyond measure. In her child's mind, scarred by terror and clinging to the confessor's words, there was only one name for such a light: the Emperor. He was watching. He was there in the storm. A profound, trembling awe washed over her, momentarily eclipsing the fear. She was not just a piece of fuel. She was seen by a god. The guards, trained for this exact moment, tightened their grips on their weapon, their faces set in grim masks under their helmets. They stood with their backs to the walls, their eyes scanning the twitching, moaning mass of psykers, ready for the inevitable outbreak. They knew the stories of Gellar field failures, of ships found adrift, filled with things that wore human skin like ill-fitting suits. The intensified hum of the field was their only shield, a sound that was both a comfort and a terrifying reminder of how thin that shield truly was. They were the last line of defense between the fragile reality of the ship and the howling, formless horror outside, and every nerve was taut with the expectation of violence. The ship's passage through the worst of the warp turbulence had subsided, leaving behind a bruised and weary silence. The air in the hold felt thin, scoured clean by the recent psychic storm, and the oppressive weight had returned, heavier than before. In the aftermath, the psykers were like survivors of a shipwreck, clinging to the wreckage of their own sanity. It was in this hollowed-out quiet that fragile, unspoken alliances began to form, small acts of humanity blooming like lichen on the cold, hard stone of their fate. Ilara, her small body exhausted from the visions, but her spirit strangely fortified by the golden light she had seen, retrieved her hidden charcoal and a fresh, purloined scrap of paper from a ration wrapper. Her script was more deliberate now, the letters formed with a child's concentrated effort. The Emperor was in the storm. He was a golden light and he saw me. The confessor says we go to help him, and I think maybe it's true. Maybe he won't let it hurt. Maybe he is kind. I will try to be brave for him. I will hold Barrow tight and not cry when the time comes. Please let him be merciful. The entry was a testament to a hope reforged in the crucible of Terra, a desperate bargain struck with the divine. She folded the paper carefully, adding it to the growing collection hidden within her stuffed toy, a secret archive of a soul preparing for its end. In his sterile quarters, Officer Valerius updated the ship's log, his stylus moving with a stiffness that betrayed his inner tension. The words on the data slate were dry and factual, a shield against the reality they described. Log entry 738.2, post-warp transit analysis. Gellar field integrity maintained at 98%. Minor fluctuations logged. Cargo manifest updated. 3 instances of self-termination recorded during peak immaterial turbulence. Methods: 1 by repeated impact against bulkhead, 2 by willed cardiac arrest. Remains processed per protocol. Morale, he paused, the word morale seeming absurdly inadequate. Cargo disposition indicates elevated stress markers. Guard patrols doubled. A rising unease is noted among the crew, a contagion of apprehension. The necessity of the mission remains absolute, yet the human cost of its execution becomes increasingly palpable. He set the stylus down, the admission hanging in the silent room. The suicides were not just statistics. They were a stark, violent rejection of the glorious purpose he was meant to enforce. The unease was not just among the psykers. It was a subtle vibration in the very command structure of the ship, a silent question being asked in the eyes of his junior officers. Confessor Ignatius, alone in his chapel, did not write in an official log. Instead, he composed a private memorandum on a sheet of vellum, the ink flowing from a quill in a precise, elegant hand. It was a post-mortem on his sermon's effectiveness, a dissection of his own spiritual performance. The homily on sacred duty was delivered with appropriate vigor and doctrinal precision. The metaphors of fuel and light were reiterated to maximize cognitive resonance. Yet, measurable impact remains inconclusive. While some subjects exhibited signs of pious acceptance, the majority displayed psychological profiles consistent with profound despair. the intervention by a member of the security detail, while a breach of procedure, appeared to have a more pronounced calming effect on a single juvenile subject than the entirety of the liturgical address. This suggests a potential flaw in the methodology of spiritual preparation. Does absolute theological truth require the suppression of basic human compassion to be effective? Or does that suppression, in fact, diminish the truth's power? He stared at the final question, a heresy in ink. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he held the vellum over a candle flame. The edges blackened and curled, the words vanishing into smoke. Some questions were too dangerous to be recorded, even in a private confession. Down in the hold, the theory Ignatius had just burned was being proven in silent practice. A gaunt man from a feral world, his eyes haunted, noticed a younger woman shivering violently. Without a word, he broke his own meager portion of nutrient paste in half and nudged the piece toward her with a grimy foot. She looked up, startled, then gave a slight, grateful nod before devouring it. Later, an older woman, her voice a raspy whisper, began to murmur a story about the twin suns of her agri-world setting over fields of golden grain. Others nearby leaned in, their eyes closed, not just hearing the words but feeling them, sharing the psychic imprint of a memory of home, of warmth, of a life before the cold and the chains. They shared names of loved ones, fragments of songs, the simple, profound details of a lost existence. No official doctrine passed between them, no sanctioned prayers, just food and stories. In that grim hold, it was the only currency of humanity they had left, and they spent it freely, forging bonds as fragile and beautiful as spun glass, knowing they were destined to be shattered, but clinging to their fleeting warmth all the same. The stench of sickness had a particular cloying texture in the recycled air of the hold, a sweet rotten smell that clung to the back of the throat. Guard Marcus had noticed it during his patrol, a sour note in the usual symphony of fear and ozone. He found its source in a recessed alcove. A man, old before his time, shivering violently in a pool of his own filth, his breathing a wet, ragged gasp. The man's psychic dampener collar glowed a steady, cautionary amber, indicating a dangerously elevated biosignature. Procedure was clear. Isolate report, let the Medici servitors handle the contamination risk. But the man's eyes, clouded with fever, held a mute, animal plea that bypassed Marcus's training and struck a chord in a part of him he tried to keep locked away. He had acted on impulse, a moment of unthinking humanity. He had radioed for a containment team, but while waiting, he had used a corner of his own uniform tabard to wipe the sweat from the man's brow, offering a few sips of water from his canteen. It was a small thing, a gesture of basic decency in a place that had none. He hadn't even known the psyker's name, but Sergeant Cale had been observing from the command overlook, his gaze as sharp and unforgiving as a barbed hook. The reprimand came not in a shouted order, but in the grim, pressurized silence of Cale's office. The sergeant stood behind his metal desk, his knuckles resting on its surface, his body a monument to rigid dogma. "Explain your actions, guardsman," Cale's voice was low, devoid of anger, which made it infinitely worse. It was the tone of a man stating an irrefutable, unpleasant fact. Marcus stood at attention, his helmet under his arm, the scent of sickness still faintly clinging to his tabard. "The subject was in medical distress, Sergeant. I stabilized the situation until the containment team arrived. You compromised your uniform. You exposed yourself to potential psychic contagion. You offered comfort to a weapon waiting to detonate." Cale's eyes, like chips of flint, bored into him. "Empathy is a flaw in our armor, Marcus. It is the crack through which corruption seeps. These are not people, they are munitions. Holy munitions, to be sure, but you do not weep for Allah's charge after it has been fired. A hot, defiant anger flared in Marcus's chest, cutting through his discipline. With respect, Sergeant, he was a dying man. Are we not meant to be the defenders of humanity? What does it say of our humanity if we cannot offer a dying man? Moment of mercy. Kale's expression did not change, but the air in the room grew colder. It says we understand the greater good. It says we recognize that the survival of billions outweighs the comfort of one. Your mercy, guardsman, is a selfish indulgence. It makes you feel righteous, but it endangers this ship, this mission, and the entire Imperium. That is the cost of your compassion. Is your fleeting feeling of moral superiority worth that price? The argument was a physical blow. Marcus wanted to shout, to argue that there had to be a line, that they could not become as soulless as the things they fought in the warp. But the words died in his throat, choked by the immovable wall of imperial logic. Kale was right by the cold calculus of their duty. To care was to be weak. To show kindness was to show a vulnerability that the enemy could exploit. He stood there, defeated, the sergeant's words etching themselves into his conscience. Later, during the shift change, the memory of the argument was a bitter taste in his mouth. The system was a cruel, perfect machine, and he was a cog that had momentarily slipped. As he made his final rounds, his eyes found Alara curled in her usual spot. She looked so small, so breakable, clutching her ragged toy. He saw the hopeful, desperate faith in her eyes when the confessor spoke, the way she had latched onto his own small, illicit kindness during the sermon. She was not a holy munition. She was a child. The decision was made in a heartbeat, another act of defiance against the crushing machine. As he passed her, he let a single high-nutrient ration bar, the kind issued to the guards for extended watch duty, fall from his vambrace. It landed with a soft tap on the grating beside her leg. He did not stop, did not look back, his pace never faltering. But from the corner of his eye, he saw her small, quick hand dart out and snatch the bar, hiding it in barrow with a furtive, terrified grace. Walking away, the weight of the sergeant's words warred with the memory of Ilara's silent, desperate gratitude. He pondered the true cost of compassion in this cruel system. It wasn't just a risk to the mission, it was a fracture in his own soul. Every act of kindness was an act of rebellion, a tiny heresy that carved another piece out of the soldier he was supposed to be. And as he left the hold, the silence at his back felt heavier than ever, filled not just with fear, but with the terrible, beautiful weight of a shared, forbidden secret. The interrogation chamber was a pocket of absolute silence, a vacuum where sound went to die. It was a stark, circular room deep within the ship's command spine, its walls lined with humming psych-dampening field generators that leached the very energy from the air. Officer Valeria stood opposite the subject, a psyker designated as Theta 7, a man whose file listed him as a powerful precognitive. Theta 7 was secured in a heavy, silvered restraint chair, his limbs locked in place, a more sophisticated version of the dampening collar glowing with a soft, blue light around his thin neck. His eyes, however, were not subdued. They were wide, pupils dilated, fixed on a point in the far distance that only he could see. Valerius had ordered this session to assess potential threats, to chart the shoals of the future that might endanger their voyage. He had expected vague portents, warnings of warp storms or internal descent. He was not prepared for the stark, personal prophecy that was about to be delivered. Valerius activated the recording rune on the table between them. State your name and designation for the record. Theta 7's head lolled slightly, but his gaze remained terrifyingly focused on that unseen point. His voice, when it came, was not his own. It was a dry, rustling whisper, like pages of ancient parchment being turned by an unseen hand. I see the golden light. Not the light of a star, but of a suffering God. It is a furnace, and we are the fuel. He began to describe it, not in the grand theological terms of Confessor Ignatius, but in visceral, horrifying detail. He spoke of a chamber of impossible scale, where the air itself crackled with the agony of 10,000 years. He described the feeling of being unmade, not in an instant, but slowly, agonizingly, as every memory, every emotion, every spark of individual consciousness was pulled apart like thread from a tapestry and fed into a ravenous, golden fire. He spoke of the throne not as a seat of power, but as a vast, psychic engine of torment, and the emperor not as a benevolent recipient, but as a conduit for a pain so vast it eclipsed all human understanding. "You will watch," the psyker whispered, his eyes finally snapping to Valerius's, holding him in a grip of psychic certainty. "You will deliver us to that altar, officer. You will stand by as our souls are shredded to sustain a dying flame. And in our final silent scream, you will hear the true cost of your duty." The words hung in the dead air of the chamber, each one a shard of ice driven into Valerius's carefully constructed composure. He terminated the session with a sharp command, the guards moving in to lead the now limp psyker away. But the vision remained, seared into his mind. It was one thing to process a statistic, to log a suicide, to rationalize a necessary sacrifice for the Imperium. It was another to have the mechanics of that sacrifice described in such intimate, horrific detail. The abstract concept of fuel had been given a voice, a face, and a sensation of ultimate, screaming agony. The cold efficiency of his duty suddenly felt like a thin veneer over an abyss of moral horror. Shaken, Valerius retreated to the one place that offered a semblance of answers, the ship's archival core. He bypassed the operational logs and tactical databases, seeking instead the ancient, digitized texts stored in the strategic theology section. He called up scrolls on the Emperor's plan, treatises on the necessity of the astronomic and historical accounts of the early days of the Golden Throne. He read of a galaxy saved from the darkness, of a species granted a future through the ultimate sacrifice of its master and the continuous, smaller sacrifices of its children. The logic was impeccable, the arguments watertight. The end, the survival of humanity, justified any means. The suffering of a few thousand psykers was a negligible price to pay for the trillions who lived under the Emperor's light. But the dry, ancient texts now seemed to bleed. The words "necessary sacrifice" were no longer clean, administrative terms. They were now stained with Theta 7's description of being unmade. The grand, strategic vision of the Emperor's plan felt distant and cold, a blueprint drawn in the blood of others. Valerius found his gaze drifting from the screen to his own hands, the hands that signed the manifests, that gave the orders. Were they the hands of a savior, dutifully executing a painful but essential task? Or were they the hands of a high priest, conducting a ritual of mass murder on an altar of cold, unforgiving logic? He had never truly questioned the why before. The how was difficult, yes, but the why had been an article of faith. Now that faith was cracking. If the foundation of this glorious imperium was an endless, silent scream from the heart of its capital, could the edifice built upon it ever be truly stable? Could a civilization founded on such a brutal, soul-consuming transaction ever be considered good, or even sane? The question was treason, but it was a treason born not of rebellion, but of a terrible, dawning comprehension. The weight of his command was no longer just the responsibility for the ship and its crew. It was the weight of this knowledge, the burden of complicity in a cycle of suffering so vast it threatened to crush the very meaning from the word duty. He sat in the humming silence of the archives, the ghost of a future scream echoing in his mind, and for the first time, Officer Valerius truly understood the price of the Emperor's light, and wondered if any end, no matter how noble, could truly justify such monstrous means. The order came down from the command deck as it always did, a directive stripped of all emotion, a simple procedural step in the long, grim journey. In the main hold, the Voxcasters embedded in the rust-streaked ceiling, usually silent or broadcasting only the confessor's sermons, crackled to life with a different kind of energy. A low, resonant hum preceded the playback, a sound that seemed to pull at the very fabric of the silence, demanding an attention more profound than any shouted command. For the psykers chained to the deck, this was not a sermon to be interpreted or a guard's order to be obeyed. This was an archive of their own fate, a chorus of ghosts speaking from the past, and the effect was immediate and visceral. The first voice to emerge from the static was thin, reedy, etched with the distance of centuries. It was a historical account, a log entry from a long-dead black ship captain, his tone one of weary, bureaucratic recitation. The third batch of sanctioned psykers was processed and delivered to the Adeptus Astra Telepathica this cycle. Their compliance was manageable. The older ones understand the necessity. The younger ones require heavier sedation. The Emperor's light must be fed, and it is a hungry fire. We do our duty so that others may sleep soundly in the dark, unaware of the price of their safety. The words were dry, but the psykers in the hold did not just hear them. They felt the psychic residue clinging to the recording, the captain's buried unease, the cold sterility of his resolve, the faint, screaming echo of the processed souls he mentioned. It was a confirmation from history itself, a chain of suffering that stretched back into the Imperium's misty past, proving their journey was not an anomaly but a tradition. Next, the Vox shifted to a different timbre, the fervent, rolling cadence of a confessor from a bygone age. This was not Ignatius, but a predecessor, his voice booming with a fire that time and static could not dim. Rejoice, for you are chosen. Your soul is the oil that greases the gears of the divine machine. Your pain is the hammer that forges the armor of humanity. Do not weep for your ending, for in your consumption you become part of something eternal, something greater than any single life could ever be. The sermon was a mirror of Ignatius's own, its rhetoric familiar, but hearing it from a dead man's lips gave it a chilling, archival weight. For some psykers, this reinforcement was a lifeline. A man near Alara, who had been quietly weeping, lifted his head, his eyes clearing as if the ancient words had scrubbed away his doubt. He nodded slowly, a grim purpose settling on his features. He was not a victim, he was a part of a grand, holy tradition. His sacrifice had a pedigree. But the Vox was not done with its lessons. The tone shifted again, this time to one of raw, undiluted panic. A distress call mangled by warp interference clawed its way from the speakers. Is the penitent sorrow, Jeller Field, failing? They're in the walls, the psykers there. The voice dissolved into a scream, a sound of pure animal terror, followed by the unmistakable wet crunch of rending metal and a chorus of inhuman shrieks that were not meant for human throats. Then, dead air. The message was a fossilized moment of catastrophic failure, a glimpse into the alternative to their orderly, if grim, procession. It was a reminder that the cold metal and the humming Jeller Field were not their prison, but their protection. The fate that awaited them on Terra was a known quantity, a ritualized end. The fate that had claimed the penitent's sorrow was formless, chaotic, and infinitely worse. This final echo proved too much for many, where the historical account had provoked thought and the ancient sermon had inspired grim resolve. The distress call unleashed pure despair. A woman a few meters from Alara let out a low, shuddering moan and began to bang her head softly against the bulkhead behind her, a rhythmic, hopeless thud that spoke of a mind seeking any escape from the unbearable truth. Another simply curled tighter into himself, his psychic presence dimming as if he were trying to erase himself before he reached the throne. Ilara listened to it all, the voices of the dead and the damned weaving a tapestry of inevitability around her. She clutched Barrow, her small fingers tracing the seam where her hidden diary was stored. The golden light she had seen in the warp felt very far away now, obscured by the grim, practical voices from the Vox. These were not the promises of a kind God, but the reports of men and women who had done this before, who saw it as a job, a duty, a terrible necessity. The hopeful bargain she had written down felt childish in the face of such cold, historical certainty. A profound weariness settled over her, not the fatigue of sleep, but the exhaustion of a soul that has seen the map of its own end and found no alternative routes. The Vox record playback was not just a broadcast, it was an induction. They were being welcomed into the long, silent fellowship of the sacrificed, their own stories soon to become just another echo in the archives of imperial necessity. In the heavy, post-Vox silence, a new language began to form. It was not a language of words, for words had proven inadequate, capable of being twisted into sermons or cold historical accounts. This was a deeper, more primal dialect, born from the shared psychic resonance that hummed between them like a live wire. The psykers, stripped of hope and bombarded by the echoes of their own fate, began to communicate in a silent, empathic understanding. A flicker of a shared memory, the scent of rain on a homeworld, the warmth of a parent's hand, would pass from one mind to another, a fleeting gift of comfort. A wave of collective dread would ripple through the hold when a guard's footsteps sounded too heavy, a silent, unified flinch. They could feel the sharp, metallic tang of another's fear, the hollow ache of another's resignation, the faint, stubborn ember of another's faith. They were becoming less a collection of individuals and more a single, wounded organism, its nerves exposed and intertwined. Ilara, sensitive and young, was particularly attuned to this silent chorus. The terror that had once threatened to shatter her now had a counterpoint in the shared, weary calm of the others. She felt the quiet, stoic endurance of an older woman across the hold, a psychic presence that felt like a weathered stone enduring a relentless sea. She felt the grim, purposeful acceptance of the man who had found solace in the ancient sermon. These emotions did not erase her own fear, but they gave it context, weaving her personal dread into the larger tapestry of their collective suffering. She was not alone in her trembling. She was one leaf shaking in a forest of fear. It was the weathered stone of a presence, the older woman who one day shifted her position slightly, catching Alara's eye. The woman's name was Lyra, though names held little meaning here. Her face was a landscape of fine lines, but her eyes were calm, deep pools of acceptance. She did not speak, but she projected a simple, clear image into the space between them, a single, smooth pebble resting in the palm of a hand. Then she mimed the act of breathing slow and deep, her own chest rising and falling in a measured rhythm. Ilara, intrigued, watched. Lyra closed her eyes, and the chaotic psychic static that constantly buzzed around her seemed to quiet, receding like a tide. She was building a wall in her mind, not of fear, but of focus. She was meditating. Tentatively, Ilara mimicked her. She closed her own eyes, clutching Barrow, and tried to focus on her breathing just as Lyra had shown her. It was impossibly difficult at first. The whispers rushed in, the cold of the deck seeped into her bones, and the memory of the Vox's distress call screamed in her ears. But then she felt it, a gentle psychic nudge from Lyra, a silent guide. It was not a command, but an invitation to a quieter place. Alara focused on the imagined pebble, on its cool, solid weight. She imagined her fear as a turbulent river and the pebble as an anchor at its center. Breathe in, breathe out. The river still raged, but the anchor held. The whispers became a distant murmur. For the first time since being taken, she found a small, quiet corner inside her own mind where the storm was not so loud. It was a profound revelation. She could not control her fate, but she could, perhaps, learn to control her fear of it. This shared, silent practice spread, a subtle contagion of calm. Psychers who had been on the verge of breaking began to adopt the measured breathing, the internal focus. There were no grand declarations, no speeches of solidarity. Instead, there was a resigned acceptance that settled over the hold, a collective sigh. They were bound not by chains of hope, but by the unbreakable chains of a shared destiny. They were all fuel for the same fire, passengers on the same final voyage. In that understanding, a fragile bond formed, stronger than any forged by kind words or shared rations. It was a bond woven from the very fabric of their shared suffering, a silent acknowledgement that they would face the golden light together, not as a terrified mob, but as a congregation of the resigned, their souls already beginning the long, slow process of letting go. The silence was a lie. It was not the quiet of resignation, but the coiled stillness before the lightning strike. The air in the hold, thick with the scent of ozone and despair, began to crackle with a new, dangerous energy. It started as a low thrum, a vibration felt in the teeth and bones rather than heard. Psychic pressure building like steam in a sealed boiler. The lumen strips flickered, their red glow stuttering in time with the ragged, collective breath of the psychers. The shared understanding that had granted them a fragile peace now became the conduit for a unified, desperate fury. They had seen the map of their end in the Vox's echoes, and a final, defiant instinct for survival, long buried under layers of terror and doctrine, erupted to the surface. It began with a single, sharp cry, not of pain, but of raw, unbottled power. A man near the main power conduit, his eyes blazing with incandescent light, threw his head back and unleashed a torrent of psychic force. It was not aimed at the guards, but at the ship itself. A conduit overhead exploded in a shower of cerulean sparks and acrid smoke. The humming of the Geller field wavered, its pitch dropping to a sickening groan. That single act was the spark in the tinderbox. All across the hold, other psychers followed, their controlled fear shattering into wild, destructive release. A woman sent a bank of monitoring servitors crashing into a wall, their metal shells crumpling like parchment. Another focused his will on the environmental controls, and the temperature began to plummet, frost blooming across the metal gratings. The ship's internal Vox system screeched with feedback, then blared a distorted, looping fragment of the ancient confessor's sermon about sacred fuel, a cruel, mocking soundtrack to the rebellion. The response from the guards was instantaneous and brutal. They were drilled for this, their training overriding any flicker of the pity some might have felt. La's fire cut through the smoky air, searing crimson lines in the gloom. The sharp ozone tang of discharged energy weapons mixed with the coppery smell of blood. Shock mauls rose and fell with sickening thuds, the sounds of impact drowned out by the screams, both psychic and physical, that now filled the cavernous space. The guards moved in. Coordinated fire teams, their faces hidden behind helmets, becoming anonymous instruments of suppression. They were a wall of ceramic and resolve slamming into a wave of desperate, psychic chaos. On the command overlook, Officer Valerius watched the scene unfold on the picked feeds, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists behind his back. The data slate on his console flashed with damage reports and casualty alerts. His voice, when he spoke into the vox bead at his collar, was flat and hard, the voice of the Imperium itself. Containment Protocol Gamma. Suppress the outbreak. Use lethal force if necessary. Protect the ship's vital systems. The orders felt like ash in his mouth. He saw not a rebellion of heretics, but a slaughter of cornered, terrified beings. He saw the man who had overloaded the conduit cut down by a precise las shot, his body slumping to the deck, the light dying in his eyes. He saw a young woman, no older than Alara, caught in the crossfire, her small form jerking as a stray bolt took her in the chest. Each death was a hammer blow to the already fractured foundation of his conviction. This was not the clean, clinical sacrifice for the Golden Throne. This was messy, ugly, and entirely his responsibility. A cold, sickening guilt washed over him, the weight of command now a crushing, bloody burden. He had given the order, and his ship was now a charnel house. As quickly as it had begun, it was over. The final, defiant psychic scream was silenced by a volley of La's fire. The last of the rebelling psykers were subdued, their bodies dragged away by servitors, leaving smears of dark red on the deck. The remaining psykers, those who had not joined the fight or had been too terrified to move, cowered in silence, the brief, wild hope of rebellion extinguished and replaced by a deeper, more profound terror. The atmosphere in the hold was no longer one of controlled dread, but of freshly applied absolute domination. The air reeked of burnt flesh, ionized air, and the stark, metallic scent of fear that had been proven entirely justified. The rebellion had been crushed, its cost measured in broken bodies and shattered spirits, a grim lesson written in blood and fire for all who remained. The silence returned, but now it was the silence of the grave, broken only by the hum of the Gellar field and the heavy, rhythmic tread of the victorious guards. The silence was a lie. It was not the quiet of resignation, but the coiled stillness before the lightning strike. The air in the hold, thick with the scent of ozone and despair, began to crackle with a new, dangerous energy. It started as a low thrum, a vibration felt in the teeth and bones rather than heard, a psychic pressure building like steam in a sealed boiler. The lumen strips flickered, their red glow stuttering in time with the ragged, collective breath of the psykers. The shared understanding that had granted them a fragile peace now became the conduit for a unified, desperate fury. They had seen the map of their end in the Vox's echoes, and a final, defiant instinct for survival, long buried under layers of terror and doctrine, erupted to the surface. It began with a single, sharp cry, not of pain, but of raw, unbottled power. A man near the main power conduit, his eyes blazing with incandescent light, threw his head back and unleashed a torrent of psychic force. It was not aimed at the guards, but at the ship itself. A conduit overhead exploded in a shower of cerulean sparks and acrid smoke. The humming of the Gellar field wavered, its pitch dropping to a sickening groan. That single act was the spark in the tinderbox. All across the hold, other psykers followed, their controlled fear shattering into wild, destructive release. A woman sent a bank of monitoring servitors crashing into a wall, their metal shells crumpling like parchment. Another focused his will on the environmental controls, and the temperature began to plummet, frost blooming across the metal gratings. The ship's internal Vox system screeched with feedback, then blared a distorted, looping fragment of the ancient confessor's sermon about sacred fuel, a cruel, mocking soundtrack to the rebellion. The response from the guards was instantaneous and brutal. They were drilled for this, their training overriding any flicker of the pity some might have felt. La's fire cut through the smoky air, searing crimson lines in the gloom. The sharp, ozone tang of discharged energy weapons mixed with the coppery smell of blood. Shock mauls rose and fell with sickening thuds, the sounds of impact drowned out by the screams, both psychic and physical, that now filled the cavernous space. The guards moved in coordinated fire teams, their faces hidden behind helmets, becoming anonymous instruments of suppression. They were a wall of ceramite and resolve slamming into a wave of desperate, psychic chaos. On the command overlook, Officer Valerius watched the scene unfold on the picked feeds, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists behind his back. The data slate on his console flashed with damage reports and casualty alerts. His voice, when he spoke into the vox bead at his collar, was flat and hard, the voice of the Imperium itself. Containment Protocol Gamma. Suppress the outbreak. Use lethal force if necessary. Protect the ship's vital systems. The orders felt like ash in his mouth. He saw not a rebellion of heretics, but a slaughter of cornered, terrified beings. He saw the man who had overloaded the conduit cut down by a precise las shot, his body slumping to the deck, the light dying in his eyes. He saw a young woman, no older than Alara, caught in the crossfire, her small form jerking as a stray bolt took her in the chest. Each death was a hammer blow to the already fractured foundation of his conviction. This was not the clean, clinical sacrifice for the Golden Throne. This was messy, ugly, and entirely his responsibility. A cold, sickening guilt washed over him, the weight of command now a crushing, bloody burden. He had given the order, and his ship was now a charnel house. As quickly as it had begun, it was over. The final, defiant psychic scream was silenced by a volley of La's fire. The last of the rebelling psykers were subdued, their bodies dragged away by servitors, leaving smears of dark red on the deck. The remaining psykers, those who had not joined the fight or had been too terrified to move, cowered in silence, the brief, wild hope of rebellion extinguished and replaced by a deeper, more profound terror. The atmosphere in the hold was no longer one of controlled dread, but of freshly applied absolute domination. The air reeked of burnt flesh, ionized air, and the stark, metallic scent of fear that had been proven entirely justified. The rebellion had been crushed, its cost measured in broken bodies and shattered spirits, a grim lesson written in blood and fire for all who remained. The silence returned, but now it was the silence of the grave, broken only by the hum of the Jeller field and the heavy, rhythmic tread of the victorious guards. The ship's violent shudder was different this time. It was not the chaotic lurch of the warp, but a deep, resonant groan of reality reasserting its dominion. The constant, teeth-grating whine of the Jeller field plummeted from a shriek to its familiar, background hum, and then faded further, becoming a memory. The transition was complete. The divine sacrifice had torn itself from the Empyrean's grip and now sailed the calm, stardusted void of the Sol system. On the command bridge, the primary viewing port, which had shown only the swirling, impossible colors of the immaterium, now framed a sight that stole the breath from every officer present. There, hanging in the black velvet of space, was Terra. Not a star, but a world, its surface a mosaic of ancient, sprawling hive cities, glittering orbital plates, and the faint, ethereal glow of the astronomic in itself. Psychic lighthouse whose silent song now pulsed through the ship's very bones. Down in the hold, the change was felt even more profoundly. The oppressive, chaotic pressure of the warp vanished, leaving a strange, hollow quiet in its wake. But that quiet was immediately filled by something else, something immense and ancient. It was a pull, a silent, psychic gravity that drew at the core of every psyker's being. It was not a voice, not a command, but a presence, a vast, golden, and agonizing awareness that settled over their souls like a physical weight. It was the Emperor. His psychic pull was a current in an invisible ocean, and they were all caught in its flow, their individual sparks drawn inexorably toward the colossal beacon of his suffering. For Alara, the feeling was both terrifying and familiar. It was the same golden light she had seen in the warp storm, but now it was no longer distant. It was everywhere, a constant, thrumming pressure in her mind that promised an end to her. Fear, not through mercy, but through absolute, final consumption. She clutched Barrow, her small body trembling not with her own terror, but with the sheer, overwhelming scale of the presence that now held her in its grasp. Across the ship, preparations for disembarkation began with a grim, rehearsed efficiency. The guards, their armor still smudged with the soot and blood of the recent rebellion, moved with a renewed, sharpened purpose. Final inspections were made, chains were checked for strength, and the remaining psykers were formed into silent, orderly lines. The air, now cycling with the thinner, processed atmosphere of the Terran approach, felt sharp and cold in the lungs. Confessor Ignatius moved through the ranks, his voice a low, resonant chant as he led the final prayers. The words were the same: sacred duty, holy fuel, eternal purpose, but they landed differently now. They were no longer abstract concepts about a distant future, but immediate, practical instructions for the final minutes of life. Some psykers recited the words with him, their voices a ragged whisper, their eyes fixed on the deck. Others simply stood in silence, their minds already halfway to the golden throne, feeling its call like a hook in their soul. Alara looked toward the sealed blast doors, beyond which lay the world she had only ever heard of in legends. She could not see its grandeur, its continent-spanning cities and millennia-old fortifications, but she could feel it. The air itself tasted of age and immense, staggering power. It was the heart of the Imperium, the center of all human civilization, and it was drawing her in to die. The mingled hope and dread created a strange, dizzying cocktail in her veins. The hope was the child's fragile belief that the golden presence might yet be kind, that the confessor's promises of peace and purpose were true. The dread was the chilling certainty she had learned in the hold, the knowledge born from broken rebellions and ghostly Vox logs. She was walking toward a god, and she was his supper. As the ship began its final docking maneuvers, the vibration of its engines a faint tremor through the deck, she closed her eyes, trying to find the quiet, meditative space Lyra had taught her. But the Emperor's psychic pull was too strong, a tidal wave that washed away all inner peace, leaving only a profound, awestruck terror and a faint, desperate sliver of hope that her end would be quick, and that the Emperor, in his infinite, painful wisdom, would find her small, offered soul to be enough. The groan of the ship's main ramp lowering was a sound of finality, a long, metallic sigh that signaled the end of their voyage and the beginning of their end. A blade of harsh, sterile light cut into the perpetual twilight of the hold, so bright after the journey's gloom that it made eyes accustomed to shadows water and blink. The air that washed in was thin, cold, and carried the scent of ozone, promethium, and the distinct, ancient dust of Terra itself. It was the breath of the throne world, and it filled lungs that had known only the recycled atmosphere of the divine sacrifice with a chilling, historic finality. The procession began with the brutal efficiency that had characterized the entire journey. Guards, their faces set in grim masks beneath their helmets, moved down the lines of psykers, their movements crisp and unyielding. Heavy, silvered manacles were checked one last time before the chains were pulled taut, linking the condemned into a single, shambling entity. There was no resistance left. The rebellion had burned the fight out of them, and the overwhelming psychic presence of the Emperor, a constant, crushing pressure on their souls, had reduced them to a state of numb compliance. They moved like sleepwalkers, their feet scuffing against the deck plating as they were led toward the blinding light of the exit. Beyond the ramp lay the landing port, a vast, cavernous space that dwarfed the ship that had carried them. The architecture was a testament to imperial grimness, all stark, brutalist angles and soaring, vaulted ceilings lost in shadows and swirling clouds of incense, pumped from great, bronze censers shaped like screaming cherubs. The walls were unadorned rockcrete, their surfaces scarred by centuries of use and stained dark by exhaust and time. Overhead, massive banners of black and gold hung limp in the still air, emblazoned with the skull and aquila, watching over the proceedings with silent, judging eyes. The only illumination came from banks of powerful lumen lamps mounted high on gantes, their beams cutting through the haze like solid pillars, illuminating the grim officials who awaited them. These were the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, their faces pale and severe within the deep cowls of their gray robes. They stood in silent, unmoving rows, data slates in hand, their eyes, some augmented with flickering optical implants, scanning each psyker with a cold, analytical detachment that made the guards' professional brutality seem almost warm by comparison. They were not jailers, they were processors, final auditors in the great logistical chain of sacrifice. Their silence was more intimidating than any shouted order, a void that absorbed the faint, choked sobs and whispered prayers of the psykers, offering no echo, no acknowledgement. Ilara, her small hand gripping the chain in front of her, was a tiny figure in the solemn, terrifying procession. The manacles around her wrists were so large they threatened to slide off her thin bones, and the weight of the chain threatened to pull her off balance with every step. But she held on, her other arm locked around Barrow, crushing the ragged toy against her chest. The stuffed bear was a soft, familiar lump in a world of hard, cold edges. As she was marched down the ramp and her feet touched the sacred soil of Terra, a tremor ran through her. The Emperor's presence was everywhere here, a psychic hum so powerful. It felt like a physical force, a golden, painful thrumming in the air and in her mind. It was the light she had seen, now made manifest, and it was terrifying. Yet, amidst the solemnity, the grim officials, and the crushing weight of destiny, a child's hope, stubborn and irrational, still flickered. She clutched Barrow tighter, her fingers finding the hidden seam where her diary was stored. Maybe, just maybe, a miracle would happen. Maybe the Emperor, in all his golden, painful majesty, would look down from his throne, see one small, frightened girl clutching her toy, and show a mercy that the confessor's sermons never mentioned. It was a desperate, impossible wish, a single, defiant star in an otherwise black and absolute sky, but she clung to it as she was led into the heart of the Imperium, a speck of hope amidst the marching dead. The procession snaked forward, a river of chained souls flowing through a canyon of imperial stone and shadow. The landing port gave way to a vast, enclosed transitway, a tunnel hewn from the living rock of the Himalayas, its ceiling lost in darkness far above. The air grew colder still, carrying a dry, ancient chill that spoke of mountains older than memory. The only sounds were the rhythmic, metallic clank of chains, the scuff of countless feet on worn stone, and the low, resonant chanting of Confessor Ignatius, who walked at the head of the grim parade. his voice a steady beacon in the oppressive silence. His prayers were a shield of words, a final fortification for their souls before they faced the ultimate reality. But the faith in his tone was a brittle thing, stretched taut over a churning sea of personal turmoil. The psykers marched toward their destiny, and their faces were a gallery of human ends. Some walked with their heads held high, their eyes burning with a fierce, tragic pride. They had internalized the sermons, wrapping themselves in the flag of their own sacrifice, seeing themselves not as victims, but as willing warriors in a war that would outlast the stars. Their steps were firm, their postures rigid with a dignity that defied their chains. Others were consumed by a raw, trembling fear that made their legs weak. They shuffled rather than walked, their gazes darting wildly, seeing not the grand architecture but the specter of the consumption that awaited them, their breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. And then there were those who had passed beyond both pride and fear into a state of hollow resignation. Their eyes were empty, their souls already detached, their bodies merely following the pull of the chain, their inner light extinguished by the overwhelming proximity of the golden throne. They were the already dead, marching to their funeral. Officer Valerius walked a few paces behind the main column, his officer's coat feeling like a shroud. He watched the varied reactions, and each one was a fresh laceration on his conscience. The proud ones made him feel like a fraud, a conductor of a lie. The terrified ones made him feel like a monster. The resigned ones made him feel nothing but a profound, soul-crushing sadness. The doubts that had been seated in the interrogation chamber and watered by the rebellion now bloomed into a forest of thorns in his mind. This was not strategy. This was not duty. This was a funeral procession he was leading, and he was the chief mourner and the executioner in one. The weight of his complicity was a physical agony, a cold stone in his gut. Every clink of the chains, every muffled sob was an accusation. He had delivered them. He had overseen their terror, their brief rebellion, their broken spirits. He saw Elara, small and clutching her toy, a flicker of impossible hope still in her eyes, and he had to look away, the sight too painful to bear. His lifelong faith in the necessity of the Imperium's brutal calculus was collapsing inward, and in its place was only the chilling vacuum of a terrible, unforgivable truth. At the front, Ignatius's voice never faltered, the litanies of sacrifice rolling from his lips with the practiced ease of a lifetime of devotion. He held his sacred text before him, but his eyes were closed, his vision turned inward. The mask of faith was a perfect fit, carved by decades of service, but beneath it his own spirit was a battleground. He could feel the Emperor's presence, a golden, agonized scream that filled the psychic ether, and it was nothing like the benevolent, paternal light of the scriptures. It was a storm of eternal, unimaginable pain. He felt the faith of the proud psykers as a fragile, beautiful lie. He felt the terror of the fearful as a justified human response. He felt the resignation of the hallowed as a tragedy of cosmic proportions. And he felt Valerius's silent crisis of conscience like a cold wind at his back. His prayers were no longer for the psykers alone. They were a desperate, silent plea for his own soul, a begging for the certainty to return, for the divine purpose to wash away the human pity that threatened to unmoor him. He gripped his Rosarius until the metal bit into his palm, using the physical pain to anchor himself to his duty, to silence the screaming question in his heart. Was he leading a congregation to salvation, or a flock to the slaughter? The march continued, a river of souls flowing inexorably toward the golden, devouring light, each step a hammer blow on the cracking foundations of faith for the two men who led them. The final doors did not open, they dissolved. One moment the procession was marching down a final, suffocatingly narrow corridor of black basalt, the air vibrating with a psychic pressure that threatened to liquefy the mind. The next, the wall at the end simply vanished, not with a sound, but with a silent, catastrophic release of energy that was felt rather than heard. They crossed the threshold, and the world exploded into a searing, silent, golden scream. The chamber was not a room, but a universe of agony. Contained within stone, its scale defied comprehension, the vaulted ceiling lost in a swirling, incandescent haze of raw power. The air itself was not air, but a thick, shimmering plasma of psychic energy, golden and blinding, that crackled with the pain of 10,000 years. It was alive, this energy, a conscious, ravenous fire that pulled at their souls with the gravity of a dying star. The source of the light was a distant, monstrous structure at the chamber's heart, the Golden Throne. It was less a seat and more a terrifying engine of arcane technology and tortured divinity, a nexus of cables, conduits, and ancient machinery that pulsed with a rhythmic, sickening light, like the heartbeat of a god in perpetual, excruciating death. And at its center, a figure, distant and indistinct, was wreathed in that same terrible, beautiful fire, a silent, suffering sun around which their entire reality now orbited. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica officials moved with a swift, chilling purpose, unchaining the psykers in groups and guiding them toward a series of glowing, circular platforms that ringed the base of the throne's dais. There was no ceremony, no final prayer. This was a transaction, the final functional step in a long logistical chain. The first group, a handful of the resigned ones whose inner lights had already been extinguished, stepped onto the platform. The golden energy in the air coalesced around them, tendrils of light caressing their forms. For a moment, they were outlined in incandescence, their bodies becoming transparent vessels for the raging power. Then they dissolved, not into ash or fire, but into pure, screaming light, their individual essences unraveling like thread from a spool, pulled taut and then absorbed into the ravenous golden storm. A silent, psychic shriek echoed through the chamber, the last, collective thought of a dozen souls being unmade, a burst of static that was instantly consumed by the throne's endless hunger. Ilera watched, her small body trembling not with her own fear, but with the overwhelming, awful majesty of the place. The hope for a miracle died a quick, clean death. There was no mercy here, only a vast, impersonal, and necessary consumption. She was next. As her group was led forward, she felt the golden energy reach for her, not with malice, but with an ancient, weary inevitability. It touched her mind, and instead of the chaotic whispers of the warp or the terror of the ship, she felt a profound, staggering connection. She felt the trillion souls of the Imperium, their hopes, their fears, their simple daily lives. She felt the ships sailing by the light of the Astronomicon, the guards standing watch on distant walls, the children sleeping safely in their homes, all of them, every one existing because of this endless, screaming sacrifice. She was not just Alara, the girl from the Agri world. She was part of the shield. She was the price of their safety. Her final thoughts were not of the men in dark armor or the cold ship or the taste of fear. They were of Lyra's quiet meditation, of Guard Marcus's whispered kindness, of the golden light in the storm that had, in its own way, been a promise. She clutched Barrow one last time, feeling the hidden papers within, the story of her journey. Then she let go. She did not fight the pull. She opened herself to the golden fire, and as it consumed her, there was no pain, only a final, breathtaking clarity. She was not being destroyed. She was being woven into the fabric of humanity itself, her small, bright spark joining the great, painful, glorious tapestry of the species, survival. A profound, impossible peace flooded through her, a sense of purpose so absolute it eclipsed everything else. She was fuel, yes, but she was also a part of the light. And in that final, golden embrace, the little girl from the fields was gone, her fear silenced, her purpose fulfilled, forever connected to the humanity she had died to save. The silence that followed was a different kind of emptiness. It was not the tense quiet of the ship's hold, pregnant with fear and the hum of the Jeller field, nor was it the solemn hush of the final march. This was the hollow, airless silence of a task completed, a duty fulfilled, a void left behind after a great and terrible engine had consumed its fuel and fallen still. Officer Valeria stood on the observation deck of a secondary orbital spire, watching the distant, glinting speck that was the divine sacrifice being serviced for its next grim pilgrimage. The throne world sprawled below him, a continent of metal and light, its billions of souls living, working, and dreaming, blissfully unaware of the silent, screaming transaction that underpinned every moment of their existence. He could still feel it, a psychic resonance clinging to his soul like frost, the final, collective sigh of the psykers as they were unmade, the ghost of Ilara's fleeting peace. He had overseen the delivery. The manifest was complete. Back in his austere quarters, the data slate felt heavier than adamantium. His stylus hovered over the final log entry for this voyage. The words that came were not the dry, administrative notations of before. They were carved from a deeper, more painful place. Final log entry, voyage 738. Cargo delivered. Mission parameters achieved. The Emperor's light is sustained for another cycle. The necessity of the sacrifice is absolute. It is the unyielding calculus of survival, the terrible arithmetic that allows the Imperium to endure. We are the gardeners who prune the tree so that it may bear fruit, the surgeons who amputate the limb to save the body. The human cost is immeasurable, an ocean of suffering upon which our civilization floats. To question, it is a luxury we cannot afford. To fail in it is a sin for which there is no forgiveness. The legacy of this duty is not glory but grief. It is a legacy of suffering, willingly borne by the few so that the many may live. We are the bearers of that legacy. We remember so that they may be forgotten. He set the stylus down. The admission changed nothing. The ships would keep sailing, the psykers would keep being gathered, the golden throne would keep burning. But for Valerius, the clean, black and white certainty of his duty was gone, replaced by a spectrum of gray stained with the color of lost souls. He would continue to serve, to command, to deliver, but he would never again be able to shield himself from the truth of what he did. The weight was now a permanent part of him. The ghost of a little girl and her stuff bare a silent witness to every order he would ever give. In the echoing quiet of his shipboard chapel, Confessor Ignatius knelt before the simple, unadorned altar. The scent of incense was a poor mask for the psychic ozone that seemed to have permanently seared itself into his senses. His sacred texts lay open, but he was not reading. Instead, a fresh sheet of vellum was stretched before him, and his quill moved with a slow, deliberate grace, inking the title of his final sermon for this voyage, On the Sustenance of Suffering. His words were not the fiery rhetoric of mobilization, nor the grand promises of glorious apotheosis. They were quieter, heavier, a lament woven with threads of steel. He wrote of suffering not as a punishment or a test, but as the fundamental, dark nutrient of humanity's continued existence. He described the Imperium as a great wounded beast, staggering through a hostile galaxy, its lifeblood a constant, silent hemorrhage of pain. The psykers were not merely fuel, he wrote. They were the willing donors of that lifeblood. Their agony was the price of the beast's next breath, the strength in its failing limbs. He spoke of the profound, terrible solidarity between the sacrificed and the saved, a bond woven not from joy or shared triumph, but from a shared burden of survival. To live in the Imperium was to be complicit in this economy of suffering. To have faith was to acknowledge this terrible, beautiful, and horrifying truth, and to find a way to endure it without going mad. He did not offer easy solace. He offered only a stark, haunting purpose gleaned from the heart of the tragedy. The purpose was not for the psykers who had already fulfilled theirs. It was for those who remained, for the guards, the officers, the countless faithful. Their purpose was to remember the cost. Their duty was to ensure that the suffering was not in vain, that the civilization bought with such a terrible currency was worth the price. It was a grim, joyless faith he was articulating, a faith built on a foundation of ashes and silent screams. But it was, he realized, the only honest faith left. He signed the parchment with a slow, deliberate hand, the ink a stark black against the white surface. The sermon was a monument, not to glory, but to the endless, quiet, necessary tragedy that was their legacy. And in the deep, resonant silence of the chapel, that legacy felt as vast and as eternal as the throne itself.